Mr. Sanders, third world debt is estimated to be roughly $420 billion. Much of that owed to financial institutions of the United States. Failure on that debt could bring down not only our economy, but the world economy. What can the U.S. do to help third world countries get a handle on that debt?
Well, as you know, the cause of the debt is that huge banks in the United States, which do not have the capital available to provide funding for affordable housing in the United States, which do not have the funding available to help Americans develop decent jobs, understood that they had the opportunity of making tremendous sums of money by lending huge amounts to undeveloped countries at very, very high interest rates. And what's going on in the world as the price of commodities fail, these countries are unable to pay back the debt. And then what the large international financial groups are doing is telling these countries to cut back on programs for their people, to lower the amount of food that their people receive, that their workers earn in income, squeeze them as hard as they can so they can pay back their debts to the huge banks. And I think what you're seeing now is a disastrous policy on the part of the huge banks. I think what has got to happen is the United States government, led by the Congress, has got to bring the underdeveloped countries together with the banks and work out a sensible payback program which will not include all of the money. There's no question, you can't get it. Furthermore, we've got to develop economic programs with the third world which will stimulate their country, not drain their countries, so that in fact they can begin to have the wealth to make some paybacks.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
And of course, we've got everybody else in the extending full TMBS universe. Welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you to the whole team and crew making this all possible. On this week's program, Krystal Ball. She's host of Rising for The Hill. You've seen her. Brilliant political analyst. We're talking about the media's war on Bernie, how to respond, and what is a long-term progressive strategy to deal with the myriad crises that this country faces, and also build a long-term project for power. Then Joshua Kahn. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project. He is our movement building coach and strategist. We've introduced him before. He's here in studio tonight to talk about tactics that can help you, whether you're in a movement of thousands of people or 5 people. More tutorials. Last time we talked about how The Simpsons could lead you through a campaign. We're getting deep and diving in on tactics tonight. Also talking about the First Nations people's resistance in Hawaii at Kanamana. What is the name of that, David? Do you know? Where the telescope is being built on that important mountain. I apologize. The name just completely... Mauna Kea. The name just escaped me. Apologies. Also, of course, shout out to Puerto Rico, where the resistance is in full effect. But of course, there's a bigger context in terms of resisting the crisis in Puerto Rico, taking on the United States colonialism and vulture capitalism in the post-game. We have a debunk with Professor Ben Burgess. We're taking on lies about the minimum wage. Boris Johnson is prime minister in the United Kingdom. We'll talk about that. The Yemeni ceasefire might be back on, but the Houthis are actually winning, if anybody can win in the genocidal context of that war. And Donald Trump, mediator for Kashmir between India and Pakistan. All that and much, much more in the post-game. And of course, we have a gem with David Griscom. A whole bunch to get to. But first, let's talk about elections in Greece that took place earlier this month. And more specifically, the loss of Syriza and the lessons that Syriza holds for the global left. When Syriza took power in 2015, they were a point of inspiration internationally for multiple reasons. One was because it was a genuine electoral breakthrough and success for a serious left party, a party that had its roots in Marxist critique, in socialist vision, and even in some areas in anarchist uprising politics. It also seemed like a potential bright spot for Greece that had been suffering under the obscene economic tyranny of the International Monetary Fund and the European Union, which had demanded a consistent, steady, and ruthless diet of austerity that was spiking poverty, inequality, decimating Greek society, leading to public suicides and a myriad of other social ills. All of the crises of modern neoliberalism, austerity, and capitalism were magnified in Greece, very analogous to the World Bank and IMF policies that the United States and European Union have exported across the world. And unfortunately, 4 years later, what we have seen is basically the complete capitulation of Syriza to global capital and the victory of the right-wing New Democratic Party, the return to power not only of a traditional Greek party, but in fact the conservative one, not the center-left socialists. Greece has been in recession for 5 years, with GDP hitting the lows of minus 10%. Syriza was elected in 2015 on a platform of helping those most in poverty and ending austerity. They immediately faced relentless pushback from the ECB, IMF, and European Commission. They held a referendum, and this was a key breaking point for them, where they put to the Greek people, do you want us to resist the Troika, reject the new demands for austerity and cuts, and see if we can chart another course? 61% of Greeks, fresh off of electing Syriza to power, voted that Greece should reject the deal. Despite having the people with them, Syriza immediately capitulated to the Troika and implemented its demands. They got nothing for it politically, and that set in motion a series of hard right moves by Syriza, not just in terms of austerity and economic policies, but arms sales to Saudi Arabia, cooperating with the most reactionary and vindictive European Union immigration policies, and a complete capitulation of making the broader argument that Yanis Varoufakis, who of course was the economics minister who resigned in protest over this, made that was true, which is that not only was the demands on Syriza vicious and counterproductive, it obscured the roots of the crisis, which absolutely included a central role of European core economies like Germany and global financial institutions that helped juice up a sort of artificial growth in Greece and things like the real estate sector, that the structural problems in Greece, which have to do with tax avoidance by oligarchs, concentrations of capital and wealth, that were facilitated and eased in place by institutions like Goldman Sachs and investors from core European Union countries, that Greece had to obscure the need to recapitalize German and French banks, that without going to a direct bailout from Central European countries themselves, they went to Greece and mandated this austerity as a way of migrating the money back. And now Syriza, in spite of a energetic effort at the ends of the campaign in an attempt to sort of reassert itself in the center left, and even some legitimate arguments from Syriza that frankly their hands may have been tied, although clearly the politics and the history showed that they needed to make a more bold choice to have any hope of political survival and any hope, most importantly, for their constituencies. What are the lessons for the United States and the United Kingdom as we run an election trying to get Bernie Sanders elected president here, as Jeremy Corbyn will soon be facing down this buffoon Boris Johnson? From the beginning, our opponents will work to undermine us. Look at the relentless media war on Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders, for that matter. There are limits to state power, And the wealthy will use everything they have to undermine progressive governance, capital flight, disinvestment, as well as the media war that we mentioned before. You're not going to be rewarded for being conciliatory. Look at Brazil. Lula da Silva lifted tens of millions out of poverty without jeopardizing the fundamental growth rates of core Brazilian industries. In fact, enhancing them in the commodities boom. He's now a political prisoner, denied power and basic due process, in spite of the fact that he was able to create a win-win for everyone, simply because his core commitment is to the poor. Conciliatory will not help you. Syriza's willingness to drive austerity did not win them any victories, and they are blamed for its failures. The Bernie Sanders campaign and a revitalized Labor Party are driven by movements. Winning power is the first step, and as Syriza and pretty much every elected left-wing government shows, rhetoric is one thing, but commitment to and harnessing social power is another. The wealthy have tremendous power outside of elected office. To challenge that power, a strong, organized social movement is needed to achieve anything transformative. Supporting movement candidates like Corbyn and Sanders is key because they can harness these movements to achieve these goals, and these movements will keep them honest and accountable to a broader shared vision. Do you guys have anything that you want to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're not saying this to sort of beat down on a country that's sort of lower on the totem pole of global imperialism. I mean, there are a lot of constraints that Greece faced. But when you look at that referendum and you saw people in the streets and understand the context of what was going on at that time, Europe, the European Commission, the ECB, they shut down the ATMs. Yep. Going into that vote. So, you know, and that was holding a country hostage, holding a people hostage. And even still, the Greek people were defiant and they were ready to fight. And capitulating on that, even though it would have been so difficult, was a real loss. I mean, you know, remember Syriza, their party name was the Coalition of the Radical Left. This was a movement that was really supposed to challenge power, and they ended up trying to find a way to be conciliatory to it. And even as they're leaving, you know, let's not forget that this is, you know, is going to go on for a very long time, obviously with New Democracy in power now. But they agreed to austerity up until 2060, right, and holding a 2.5% budget surplus. I mean, it's horrendous what's happened. So when we look at the opportunities for the left to win power, we can't just think that winning an election is the end. You have to be able to use those social movements, because the powers that be are going to use everything that they have to try to crush any kind of radical change.
And I think we need to also be honest about the uncertainty, especially in a context like that. I mean, they absolutely are a subject power. So as an example, I mean, in other ways, look, someone like Sanders will literally face the heart of empire in some respects if he's president, and I'm only slightly being melodramatic there. But on the other hand, even, you know, being head of the United Kingdom, you're not pegged to the euro. Being head of the United States, you are running the most powerful country on earth. Greece is absolutely in subordinate position in the global system. So I don't like the scenario. I don't like the counter argument that everybody makes. Oh, it's just they didn't want it enough. They got corrupted. I think these lessons get very lazy. But I do think that there was a moment of clear uncertainty for Syriza where they could have chosen to fundamentally challenge the Troika, and it might have been a great failure. But the problem is that they accepted the frame at the end of the day that they weren't already in complete abject failure. And so that's the point, is that it might have been an extraordinary risk, and we can't guarantee the success. That would be misleading. But the risk simply needed to be taken because there was no other option from the perspective of human-centered politics.
That's why, you know, there's certain things that Obama did, like with the Merrick Garland thing, for instance, that like were annoying, but it was what he was.
Right.
So he was keeping almost the trial very pure. So we're going to figure out what this type of liberalism can get us. And so it is more frustrating when a left party who, like, you might as well go with what got you there, right? Like,
absolutely.
And then everyone else can learn from it then.
And there's also, and just as credibly, I mean, there's a disaster scenario, then there's also a actually the Central European policymakers don't want to break up the European Union and lose, especially in the narrative of Europe, what is the founding and the seat of Europe. There's a cultural cachet to Greece. I mean, they could have leaned into it a lot more. And I think the point is exactly that they literally needed to.
And I just, just to add on this, I think the reason we're talking about this as a lesson and not like a condemnation, right? Is to recognize something that we've been finding more and more is that if we want to have these radical parties and they're elected to fight, they have to fight. And the really frustrating thing that's happened in Syriza is when you have this defiant moment and you literally have people in the street and this massive opportunity, once you turn your back on them, now 4 years later, you implemented austerity even harsher than the people you took out in the first place. Now the radical left is associated with austerity, bad governance, all that kind of stuff. And that's the real frustration, because the social movement that took, decades to develop. And also, let's not forget, this austerity has destroyed a social safety net in Greece that was won from hard work and like socialist organizing. And in 5-6 years, was completely dismantled, right? Recognize all that work that has gone into that moment. To see it disappear is something that we need to be very careful about, especially in the United States, where we've developed such a, an interesting and resurgent left. But, that could go away very quickly with a few big disappointments or a failure to act when we have the opportunity to.
Absolutely. I just want to say we have a few more things to get to really briefly, and then we got to Krystal Ball. But tomorrow, on the show that Matt super produces and I co-host, The Majority Report, we are doing streaming coverage of the Mueller hearings. That will probably be one of the only times you'll hear Mueller on this show. Look, I'm third way about this stuff in the sense that, we've talked. I'm not even going to review all the old Russia arguments. All I can say is I am not stoked to be doing that at 8 o'clock in the morning. So if at times I digress into an impression of Sam covering the Mueller hearings in a completely non sequitur way, you guys will all know where that's coming from. All right, let's get to the shout out.
I'm looking for a remix. And now the shout out. Valuable shout out.
Pile of ideas returned to low. It's quickly moving into a hot position.
And now the shout out.
Pause the video. Recovery mode.
Shout out.
My brain is
Shout out.
Geopolitical politics.
Shout out.
competition
Yes.
would start kicking in.
Shout out.
Lots of
Geopolitical
other
politics.
brothers.
Shout out.
Do some research for yourself.
Man. Somebody asked me if I could continue to think of ways to call Dave Rubin stupid, and the answer is both yes and no. Yes, in this there's always room for innovation, but I think there's also some standby words that continuously work.
I mean, you also have Duolingo now.
That's right.
Could
I'm gonna be calling him a fucking moron in Portuguese.
Work up to tier 3.
Yeah. How you took Portuguese on the internet? What can you say? Free Lula and Dave Rubin is a fucking idiot. All right, guys, there is a serious uprising in Puerto Rico. And just like in obviously, look, there's always a bigger, I don't like to cover things in terms of, there's a scandal and then there's protests. There's always a bigger context, obviously. But it's interesting to me that just as the explosive reporting out of the Lava Jato corruption in Brazil has to do with leaked leaked text messages, this scandal does as well. And Puerto Rico's governor was basically revealed to, along with his inner circle, to be engaging in everything from, it looks like, significant corruption schemes to just also engaging in like boorish homophobic bullshit. This is a report that just dropped, and again, there's been huge demonstrations across Puerto Rico, civil disobedience, riot gear responses from cops, very brutal response. The governor has refused to resign, although he claims he won't seek re-election. I would be very wary of that promise. And now here is a report that, in fact, there are warrants for the governor and 11 associates' cell phones. Let's check out this report.
I just confirmed with the Department of Justice here in Puerto Rico that they have executed search warrants on the governor of Puerto Rico and every other individual who is a part of the Ricky chats, the chats that were leaked. So apparently The governor and the 11 others involved in the chat were ordered to surrender their cell phone to the Department of Justice. I don't know who turned in their cell phone. I don't know who didn't turn in their cell phone. But not everybody did. So search warrants have been executed in order to collect the phones. I have repeatedly asked the governor's office over the last several days whether or not the governor surrendered his cell phone. No response, not once. I'm about to ask them again. But anyway, I just want to let you know that we have confirmed search warrants have been served on every individual, including the governor of Puerto Rico, to get the cell phone as part of the investigation into those chats.
And so, you know, the bigger picture, obviously, with Puerto Rico is that Puerto Rico is a colony. Puerto Rico is overseen by a predatory hedge fund board, which was created out of the Promesa legislation that flowed out of the Obama administration's arguing and being confirmed in the court system, essentially, the continuity of Puerto Rico's status as what is in effect and in reality a colony. I do want to note that both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren voted against the oversight board legislation, which is purely there to implement austerity and on behalf of vulture capitalists in primarily New York and Boston. Tulsi Gabbard actually voted in favor of that legislation. I think that's quite important to note because she's been making great noises. In fact, she went to Puerto Rico, which all candidates should, but disturbingly, she was on the wrong side of that vote. For a little bit more context and actually just to kind of synthesize things a little bit here, let's play a brief clip of Yanis Varoufakis talking with Amy Goodman about the Puerto Rican situation as well. You just need to turn the volume up.
And apply to the case of Puerto Rico. The whole point of the New Deal, of FDR's New Deal, was to stop this process of, after a binge of the financial sector that goes wrong, and you have the collapsing pyramids of debt that it creates, to shift cynically...
The 1929 depression.
Yes, to shift cynically the burden and to liquidate the little people. To shift the burden of the financiers onto the weakest of shoulders. That was the whole point of the New Deal, and all the institutions that the New Deal created, like the FDIC, like Social Security, and so on. Puerto Rico is part of the same monetary union. Its people are supposed to be U.S. citizens, and yet they are not. They were never part of this New Deal, and you have the whole.
And they cannot vote for president of the United States.
The whole force of evil that was imposed upon the little people in 1929, 1930 under the Hoover administration, being imposed upon a small island nation that has also been devastated by this terrible hurricane, which is not completely unconnected.
And he goes on, of course, to talk about the climate dimension in this. I just want to quote briefly from Nelson Denis, who's excellent. He wrote a really good piece called After a Century of Citizenship, Puerto Ricans Have Little to Show for It in 2017 in The Nation. In Puerto Rico v. Sanchez Vallejo, this is in 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed with the Obama administration's argument that Puerto Rico is a territorial possession of the United States with no political or judicial sovereignty whatsoever. That same day, the House of Representatives passed the Puerto Rico Oversight, Management, and Economic Stability Act, PROMESA, to create a financial control board empowered to manage the entire Puerto Rican economy. The Financial Control Board is now the de facto government, banker, judge, and juror and executioner of Puerto Rico. And of course, he goes on to talk about the vicious implementation of austerity. Puerto Rico has some of the, I think, the highest poverty rates inside the United States. It has a per capita income that is roughly half of that of Mississippi, which is the poorest state in the United States. And this governor, Ricardo Rosello, and this team, these politicians are the local corrupt point people for a colonial system that is designed to benefit vulture hedge fund capital. Look, there's a colonial relationship with the United States and all of Caribbean and Latin America. Look at our bases there. Look at our policies on migration and the drug war and the coups that we support. It's all part of the same pattern. But in Puerto Rico, there isn't even the veneer of any type of actually formalized post-colonial status. It's raw colonialism. So shout out all solidarity, and Puerto Rican citizens need to be able to choose whether or not to become the 51st state or an independent nation that is paid a massive amount of restitution to. I'll just be this really brief today. Become a patron, patreon.com/TMBS. Double the content. And now for those subscribing on iTunes, you get little snippets of the illicit history, so you can get a flavor. Last week we talked about Sudanese Marxism with Ahmed Cabello, who will be a guest on the main show soon. Grab your tickets to the Chicago live show. Chuck Mertz is going to be there. This is hell. They're starting to pick up at a fast pace again. If Brooklyn and LA are any lesson, do not wait till the last minute. Grab your tickets today. Hit subscribe to everything. You can donate to us on the super chat while we do this. This helps us grow. Hit the bell button so you get notifications for live streams. I do live streams sometimes besides the main show. Most importantly, get all the content as a patron. We're going to patreon.com/TMBS. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with Krystal Ball. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, it's a debut, and I'm very excited to be announcing it. Krystal Ball. She's the co-host of Rising on the Hill TV. Krystal, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm nervous.
So we have so much to talk about, and I just want to, we're going to start with this clip because this clip just disgusts me so much. Like, it actually pissed me off. And I have to tell you, like, I have a pretty, not much like actually pisses me off. There's sort of like the, yeah, fuck this person, you know, whatever. This one I thought was grotesque. What is,
this one got you.
You know what video I'm talking about, right?
Oh, yeah.
What is her name? Do you guys know her name? Mimi Roca. Mimi Roca. And I should say a bunch of co-panelists who are nodding, like she should have been responded to like somebody huffing glue outside of Penn Station. But let's check this out. This is Mimi Roca last week on MSNBC talking about her feelings about Bernie Sanders. And then Krystal, I'm going to throw to you because I think this has a lot of lessons about how Sanders is treated generally.
I think, having Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren next to each other will really highlight, because for me, as, again, I'm not the political analyst here, but just as a woman, probably considered a somewhat moderate Democrat, Bernie Sanders makes my skin crawl, and I can't even identify for you what exactly it is, but I see him as sort of a not pro-woman candidate. And so having the two of them there, like, I don't understand young women who support him. And I'm hoping that having him next to her will help highlight that, because those are the people that if I were her, I would want to say, well, why are you supporting him and not me if you're going to choose between the two of us?
Krystal, what's going on there?
Well, in fairness to Mimi, no, just kidding. There's no defense here. I mean, this clip
literally
has everything. You have the person who right away prefaces the fact that they're not a political analyst. They really have no idea what they're talking about, right? With the insinuation backed up by absolutely nothing that Bernie Sanders is not a pro-woman candidate, when, of course, all of his positions, not to mention 40 years of public service, would tell you otherwise. There's that. There's zero statistical data used to back it up. And then there's also the just gross condescension of claiming to speak for all women, but then also condescending towards the women who do in fact support Bernie Sanders. And that all of this passes for analysis on, a very important and influential network. Yeah, it kind of says it all, doesn't it?
It says it all. And it also says that nobody else said, like, hey, do you want to rephrase that? Because you just embarrassed all of us and yourself. Instead, we have, like, Zerlina Maxwell's pumping her head, like, oh, yeah, that makes total sense.
Or like, hey, even, how about you back that up? Like, you say he's not pro-woman. What do you mean? Would be a logical question, follow-up, as, someone who does this regularly. But even her, that she would be asked to opine on this is in itself problematic. But again, as long as you are kind of saying what they want to hear, then they're happy to have you say it and not give any pushback.
Do you think, though, I mean, partially what disgusted me so much about this comment, you know, look, obviously I'm a Sanders supporter. I you know, and the larger media reality is that, you know, you couldn't get away with saying this about, I mean, forget Warren. You could not say this, I think, about any other candidate on MSNBC without, I mean, let alone pushback, I would say a conniption, right? Like this, the kind of casual contempt. But I want to connect it to when she talks about young women specifically, right? Because it's not just this weird, I mean, a lot of mainstream pundits, and I think we can get into like the various class reasons and so on, but they have weird psychological fixation about hating Bernie Sanders, right? Like I don't support you know, Harris as an example. We just have different politics, but I don't like have a life built around having a weird fixation on hating her the way these people do with Bernie Sanders. But when you talk about young women specifically, and this is just like a statistical overlap, you're disregarding the fact that, yes, a lot of young voters in general support Bernie Sanders because they're disproportionately affected by things like student debt and income inequality. So the contempt she has there accidentally basically extends to the entirety of the American working class. Almost like the hatred for him is a stand-in for a bigger hatred.
Well, and I think you're exactly right. I do think there's something, and I can't quite put my finger on it. There's something about Bernie Sanders that is like a trigger, right? Because he doesn't play by their rules. He doesn't really respect them or, you know, adhere to the traditions they want to see or like play the role that they want him to play. There's a bit of a mutual antipathy there, I think it's fair to say. Mm-hmm. But you also have this phenomenon, which I certainly saw and experienced when I was at MSNBC, where the world that they live in, especially, you know, the folks that are up in New York, is a very rarefied world. So, for example, and also, unlike YouTube, where you get instant data on what is doing well, what your audience is interested in, you get comments, you get feedback, like you can see right away what people want to hear about and what they don't, for better or worse. It's actually very squishy, the data in the cable news world. So that allows for people to make all sorts of assumptions about what the audience does or doesn't want to hear. So, for example, when I was at MSNBC during, you know, the run-up to the 2016 election, I was told that the audience didn't care about and voters didn't care about TPP, right? It wasn't interesting. People don't care about it. We're not going to cover it. So, obviously, TPP became one of the central issues. It was one of the most important things that people cared about the most in the 2016 election. But because it wasn't a conversation that was being had on the Upper East or Upper West Side in Manhattan, there was an assumption made that that wasn't a topic that was interesting to people. And I think it's the same. I think there's the same similar dynamic going on here with Bernie Sanders, because if you look at who supports Bernie Sanders, right? Who is makes up the Bernie Sanders coalition? It's disproportionately working class people. It's disproportionately people who do not have college degrees, who are making less than $50,000 a year. And those are just not the sorts of folks that Mimi Rocha, who I'm sure is not a bad person, and I'm sure, like, you know, is trying to express the best that she can, which she actually thinks is going on in politics.
I'm sorry. Get you in trouble. Well, I'll just.
Those are just aren't the people that she's coming in contact with.
Right.
So it's outside of her purview of understanding.
You know, I don't want to turn like class, like I try to on this show talk about like, you know, class is like a process in the economy more so than an identity, right? And I actually get super skeptical of the way people talk about kind of class as an identity in mainstream media, because all of a sudden it like turns into having nothing to do with where you're at financially or professionally. It's all like, oh, well, you know, you could be a multimillionaire, but if you like drink, you know, Budweiser, watch NASCAR or whatever, then you have working class sensibilities, which is another like delusional way that this stuff is covered in media. But I will say, it just seems
True.
that, there's some recognition, and even though these places still do not achieve it, right? But there is a generic recognition in the MSNBC universe that, like, if you're going to have a segment that deals with women or African Americans or so on, you probably should have some people that actually are from those groups. On the flip, when you're talking about Bernie Sanders, when you're talking about cutting Social Security, or you're saying nobody cares about TPP, it's this inbuilt, like, well, everybody working here's parents could, pay for them to have an apartment where they did it while they did an unpaid internship. It's completely screened out.
100% correct. And it's a reflection of the society at large, right? We have, as a culture, not placed value on class diversity, have not placed value on having people of, from the working class or middle class backgrounds in positions of leadership, right? Or as people who have a prominent voice or who have power. I mean, this is a larger cultural issue, but it certainly plays out on MSNBC and CNN and other places, where then you end up with these bizarre segments where, it's like the reporters are going on safari in their own country, trying to figure out what the peasants are really talking about, rather than actually incorporating those voices as voices of authority into the coverage that you're putting out to the country.
So what's the Bernie play? Like this morning I was on, I should say, like, I'm friends with Bree Joy Gray, who's his press secretary. She used to be on the show all the time. I guess now I say too many inflammatory things for her to regularly be on, Krystal. But no, but
she's got a lot going, I think.
The gulag segment was maybe a little controversial. But I was on the podcast this morning on Hear the Burn, talking about Bernie and Lula, Brazil, foreign policy. He's built this whole alternative media infrastructure. What do you think, if you were to take a strategic approach to how Bernie deals with the media as sort of like often another impediment, what's the best path there, do you think? My
thinking, and I actually have been thinking a little bit about this, is they've done a great job cultivating the alternative media approach, and I think that's awesome. They need to do that. That's predominantly where a lot of their coalition can be found anyway. So I think that piece has been really smart. But I would be a little bit less careful about doing the mainstream media outlets and, let Bernie get in there and be feisty and call people out when they're being unfair. Make that more of a point of conversation that's happening nationally, and not just in alternative media of, hey, how are we covering this election? And are you getting the facts right on Medicare for all? And how are we looking at this issue? And he's a very, obviously, incredibly effective communicator. And the Mimi Rokas of the world aside, people find him really compelling and, in his own special way, very charming.
Right.
So I would open the floodgates a bit more and take some more risks and put him out there. I mean, you look at, I thought, and this was very controversial, but I thought that Bernie's town hall on Fox News was one of the better moments of his campaign, because the guy's just fearless. He's not afraid to call bullshit on the bullshit. He's not afraid to do his thing in hostile territory. I think we need to see more of that from them. He's got to be out there a little bit more than he's been so far.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I'm a little confused looking at that campaign, because I think they are doing a lot right. But to me, two really successful moments, which I could see being controversial, and maybe the more risky thing to do, was when they sent that letter to the Center for American Progress several months ago, like, yo, we're not going to just, you're not going to just attack the guy with bullshit all the time. We're going to come back at you if this is going to just be like a cheap tabloid oppo shop on us. And yes, he did an incredible job at the Fox Town Hall. And why I'm wondering. I think in general, if you got that kind of feedback loop, I do wonder why there isn't more of that from the campaign.
Yeah, and I don't have the answer to that. I mean, I think, he has, rightfully so, a healthy skepticism of the press and, doesn't necessarily enjoy those appearances when he has to go on and tolerate what are oftentimes stupid, uninformed questions that he's constantly having to reframe the premise of, or the kind of horse race stuff that, he doesn't have use for that. He wants to talk about policy ideas, the movement, how we're going to actually make change for people. And so I get why I'm not excited about it. I don't do cable news anymore. So I certainly understand why Bernie Sanders thinks that, there are better uses of his time. But I think that you have to find all the people where they're at, and there is an audience there, and unfortunately, it's a disproportionately elite audience, and unfortunately, elite audiences still very much control a lot of the information flow in the country. So, if, to the extent that I was able to offer any advice there, I'd advocate for a more aggressive, higher risk mainstream media approach than what's been taken so far.
Do you think, I want to widen the lens with you for broader thoughts about a long-term strategy for, just say more broadly, like a progressive politics in America. Do you think that on the flip side, the squad, which I guess we're calling them now, I kind of resist that, to be honest, but it's the four cool members of Congress. They have been pretty unafraid and pretty
We found four.
The what four?
Yeah. I said we found four. We found four cool ones.
Right, exactly. What do you make of their willingness to acknowledge the reality that there is actually a war inside the Democratic Party?
I think the way that those women have operated has been brilliant. And I think they are some of the only ones in the Democratic Party who actually understand the moment that we are living through from a cultural, political, and certainly media perspective. And part of that currency is that, they don't hide it when they're unhappy. They don't owe anything to the Democratic establishment, so they're not afraid to take them on, right? They have their own power bases. And just look at, did you see this poll that just came out? I think it was Marist poll, Marist, NPR, PBS, I can't remember. But they polled 20 different issues for their popularity. And Green New Deal, a concept that a year ago no one could have told you what it was, is now one of the most popular policy ideas in the country. And a lot of that credit, of course, the credit belongs to the movement activists who have been pushing this idea and crafting it and getting it ready for prime time. But in terms of pushing it into public consciousness and awareness, AOC has been incredible. And so when I see all this hand-wringing about, oh my God, she's taking the Democratic Party off the cliff and it's a disaster and et cetera, what are you talking about? Finally, we have someone who actually knows how to do combat, who's actually exciting people, and who, by the way, has put forward what we've been wringing our hands about. Oh, the Democratic Party has no vision for the future, and we need an overarching framework that people can understand. And here AOC has presented one to the American public, and they're like, yeah, we're down with that. We're into it. And now all the presidential candidates are embracing at least parts of it and rushing to get their climate plans out and be right on the issue. How can you argue with the effectiveness of their strategy at this point?
Do you think what makes that sort of utter cowardice with these people? Because, one part I think of understanding the conflict in the Democratic Party is absolutely who is aligned with capital and who isn't aligned with capital, and what people's ideological commitments are to some extent, and the fact that we could tell a longer story, right? That like, the sort of broader collapse of labor unions, the rise of totally unregulated capital, how that affects center-left parties, right? Like, there's this really important historical contextual understanding, which I'd love you to comment on too. But there's also like, I can think of politicians who I really don't like. I have totally different politics from. Bill Clinton in some ways, or a Tony Blair in some ways, right? Who weren't just like constitutionally and temperamentally wussbags. And so it's like, when I look at the Democratic leadership, it's like, look, I understand. Of course, we're going to be on the opposite side of Chuck Schumer. He's a Wall Street handsmaiden. But that doesn't, like, Harry Reid and I have very different politics, but I think Harry Reid understood, like, fuck Republicans and let's get at it. What is it with this leadership class?
Yeah, well, I think that Democrats writ large have this sort of lingering PTSD, and you can see that it's a bit of a generational issue, right? Mm-hmm. But much of the leadership and the over 50 certainly members of the Democratic Party still have this belief that no amount of data could shake them from that the country is really center right. And this is Ryan Grimm really makes this case much more profoundly and powerfully than I could. But basically, that the country is center right. And so we have to not really tell the voters what we really want. We've always got to hedge. We've always got to come back further to the quote unquote center than we want to. We've got to work with the Republicans if we're going to hold power. And it's all just in the service of, this is what we've got to do to be able to win elections. And that was Hillary Clinton, right? She said, I'm a pragmatic progressive. That's the way they see it. Like, in my heart, I'm right there with you, but I'm the one who gets the way that we have to win. Of course, that ignores the fact that, let's put Hillary Clinton aside. In the 8 years before that, while we had a Democratic president, we lost close to 1,000 state legislative seats, governor's mansions, we lost the House, we lost the Senate, and of course then we lost the presidency. So while we were so fixated on the compromises we had to make to win elections, we just kept losing elections. But I think that PTSD of being in the wilderness and then the way that Bill Clinton, I'm not even going to say the way that he ran, because the way he actually ran his first campaign was rather populist. Right. But the way that he governed, that has been so embedded in the mindset of this set of Democrats that there's no getting out of it, I think. And no facts or data could possibly shake them from this sort of foundational view. And then you also get into the psychology of where does your power base come from, and what's the system that you were able to thrive in, right? What got you to your leadership position? And if it's a legacy system, then of course you're going to be invested in maintaining that legacy system.
What do you think are if you were designing the blueprint for not only winning, doing something really important? I obviously think getting Sanders elected is incredibly important. But I think another thing that the right does is that, later on in the show, we're going to talking with a brilliant movement organizer on tactics. And the last time he was on, we talked about strategy, right? And sometimes when you look at the political parties, the right is amazing at strategy and tactics, and the Democrats and liberals are sometimes good at tactics. So, what would be a plan? Fair. As someone who really understands this stuff, and I think has this deep understanding of a lot of different dynamics, both inside and outside, right? What do you think the kind of blueprint is if you were going to have a plan or a play for us moving forward to acquire and maybe actually start to sustain power?
Well, I listened to some of your, what you were talking about earlier with Greece in particular, and you talked a little bit about kind of the theory of political change, right, that you have to embrace in order to really be successful as a leftist movement. And I I think you have to put that at the center even more than the particular policies. What matters to me is that theory of political change. So if you are going to operate within the current system, given the current, current structure of who has influence and how much the money matters and all the way things that work in Washington and across the country, really, and having to go to the Republicans with your hat in hand when they have no interest in giving you a win ever. Like, if you're going to work within that system, you're going to fail, period, end of story. And people know that, right? So that reality ties into the electoral reality that if you're offering people like, oh, I'm going to work with the Republicans, they're like, no, you're not. Like, you may try, but that's just not going to work, right? So you have to first and foremost offer people a vision for the future that they actually think, like actually believe is going to make a difference in their lives. Now, that's a fucking hard thing to do, right? And that's why I don't know that I'm going to give you the full blueprint today, but I'll tell you a little bit of why I think that leftist populist movements around the globe have had more trouble than the right-wing, quote-unquote, populist movements. It's because if you pin a lot of your ideology around basically some sort of racial supremacy, that's very easy to deliver on without passing a single bill, right? You get a sort of psychological welfare just from the president telling these congresswomen to go back where they came from, right? That's a psychological benefit to, people who are looking to be put back in the place where they think that they deserve and belong. Right. On the left, you have to actually deliver the good, right? And so if you aren't talking about a theory of political change that is big enough for people to believe that you're really going to make a difference in their lives that they're going to be able to see, they're just going to think you're full of it like every other politician. And so, again, I don't think that's a blueprint, but I think that's where you have to start from. And if you aren't, if you aren't fundamentally changing some of the dynamics and the incentives that operate in our system and making structural change, then I don't think you get past the starting gates with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And that's another reason I just want to say, one of the reasons that I'm such a strong advocate for Lula, and I've covered him so much, I think actually you just framed, in addition to the fact that he absolutely is, in my opinion, a political prisoner and an incredibly successful president, I actually think he did that. One, look, delivered tens of millions of people out of poverty. But two, I think that he actually did communicate this incredibly effective, no, this way of doing things is better, right? This is make Brazil happy again, right? A society where prosperity is growing, where you're enjoying your life and more people are being taken care of, and you don't have to divide yourself into some pathetic little sort of racial hierarchy. And in fact, we're going to challenge that, but in this very broad-based, visceral way. Again, the dude would have beat Bolsonaro. I think that that is something to the synthesis. And I think you're also right about the inbuilt advantage of, Trump and all these guys are total 1% people, but they can dispense with the racism and the xenophobia, and that charges up their base, and that costs nothing. You're totally right.
It's sheer joy. You look at that rally crowd chanting "Send her back." That's what they came. They're so happy in that moment to be able to assert their dominance. And look, I'm not one that believes everyone is racist or everyone that supported Trump is racist. I grew up in rural America. I live in rural America. I lived in Kentucky during the 2016 election. I actually love these people. But you can't deny that white supremacy at its core is essentially an economic message, right? It's right. Okay, well, these people screwed you over. We're going to give it back to you, right? And to our great shame, the Democrats were not able to offer anything that was superior to that incredibly shitty, not to mention immoral economic message.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what was the response? Was and now Beyonce.
Yeah.
No economic plan, but we have Pharrell.
Well, and it was like, oh, what's our economic plan? Let me do a battery of polls, and I'll get back to you on that. You know, because it's certainly not going to be what I said 2 years ago or 4 years ago. Got to figure this out on the fly. I mean, and that's the other thing. We were, again, digging into this poll that had all the issue questions, and Green New Deal polled very well, and there's some sort of contradictory information on healthcare and Medicare for all, and some of the immigration positions that, you know, on decriminalizing undocumented immigration, like those things polled very poorly. And so we were talking about that on the show, and what I said is, look, we've tried the poll-tested route. People are much less interested in, do I align with you on every issue, than, like, do I believe in you and do I think that you're full of shit? So one of the things that Trump did that worked very effectively is he said a bunch of things that no one would ever tell you to say, right? They were terrible things to say. Everyone say, don't say these things, and he said them anyway, and that made people believe, wrongly obviously, but believe that he was really saying what he thought. So I think people overestimate how much your specific positioning on an ideological spectrum matters, and dramatically underestimate how much they believe that you're really going to deliver for them on the core things that they've sort of signed up for, which is why you see, like, Biden and Bernie, right, leading in the polls and have very similar demographics that they appeal to. If you ask Biden voters who their second choice is, they say Bernie, and vice versa, even though they're obviously at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. But there's more going on there than just where the political positioning falls.
I completely agree with you. And actually, just to loop back before we go, that's another reason why your point about Bernie going into the lion's den is so important. When he does things like tell Cap not to fuck with him, which, again, it's such a narrow story that most people would have no idea what you're talking about or care, nor should they. But the general sentiment of, you know what, that is a tangible example now of what he will do in 20 months when he's in the president, and everything's coming at him and he's saying, no, I'm getting everybody health care, and no, I'm canceling debt, and so on and so on. It's the showing. And I think that actually overlaps exactly with your super shrewd advice about going on mainstream outlets.
Well, and one last thought on that is, Bernie Sanders is a different kind of figure, right? And so I think some people also have a hard time wrapping their head around imagining him as president. So I think some more, like, international travel, right? Some settings where you can see him playing that role on the world stage. I think that also could be a benefit to the campaign.
Totally. That's such a good call. Krystal Ball is the co-host of Rising. It's on the Hill TV. It's great. It's the morning show you're going to watch. When you see it, you will... I don't know, if you're like a tech person, you'll block Morning Joe from ever showing up on your feed. But you should have anyways.
It's a great show when you're on, Michael.
It's always my pleasure. Anytime you want. I have a great time coming on the show, and I hope that you will come back to TMBS again soon.
Happy to do it anytime.
All right.
Have a good one, Michael. Great to chat with you guys.
Too. Thanks so much. All right, folks. What we're going to do now is we're going to do the gem, and then we're going to take a brief break. And then Joshua Kahn in studio is going to join us. I'm very excited about this. Sorry for banging the table.
So this is actually pretty interesting. A report that just came out in Los Angeles about a new strategy that Silicon Valley companies and just companies in general are using to try to subvert any kind of basic workers' protections, workers' rights in general.
Sure.
Get Around, if you're not familiar with it, is a company that allows users to rent out their cars. They have employees, though, who are basically moving the cars around. And, of course, they were not considering these employees, as employees. They were considering them to be independent contractors, despite the fact that they wore uniforms, they didn't make their own schedule, they had to go to training, and they were assigned shifts. So anyways, this is going on for a few years, and there starts to become a movement that there's basically going to become a class action suit against the company.
Awesome.
Well, the company begins sending out checks to these workers, and you got to remember that many of these people are low-wage workers, so they're sending out, $300, $400, $500 in some cases, around $1,000 to $2,000 to people, and saying, just sign this little sheet of paper. And of course, the sheet of paper was encouraging these workers to sign away all of their legal rights. They were hoping to squash this class action lawsuit. The company then was informed by their counsel that the sheet of paper that they had all these people sign was too broad, and actually would not be able to hold up in court because it was so egregious and offensive to any kind of decency or understanding of law. So then the company contacted all these people, offered them around $100 to sign another waiver, and threatened them, though, that if they did not sign this, they would sue them for the money that they took in the first place. So now we need to recognize what it's like for those workers. If you are already working a kind of low wage gig job, you get a couple $100, and for most people who are working paycheck to paycheck, that gives you a little bit of breathing room, so it's something that is very attractive to people. This is a tactic that's used by a company by Get Around because it's significantly cheaper than paying out the overall cost of a successful lawsuit that would really challenge the abusive practices of Get Around. So just to give us the context of this, Get Around paid out a total of $145,000, while the legal settlement is estimated to be somewhere around, if it went through, $1.6 million. So the company understands that their workers are pressed for cash, and that many workers will forego their legal rights. And this is something that we're seeing more and more across the country as much more work becomes centralized into a few corporations, especially all these kind of gig work. So you're talking about delivery drivers, Uber, things like that. One company can basically push around an entire sector of workers who are atomized because they're not necessarily working with one another. And oftentimes these are temporary workers. Just talking about temporary workers in general, interns, according to a new Wall Street Journal report, are increasingly being forced to sign non-compete clauses. Which, obviously, the entire intern system in the U.S. is a problem, especially unpaid internships. But this, just like
I never knew feudalism would be so funny.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing because it slaps in the face the entire neoliberal logic of interns in the first place, is to get some experience so that you can go and take it somewhere else. And obviously, people have seen, there's a really interesting report in the New York Times, a story about a reporter who worked as a DoorDash delivery person that came out over the weekend. I highly suggest you read it. And obviously, everyone's been talking about, again, what's going on at DoorDash, where they're taking the tips to subsidize the wages that they're paying for the workers. So, if they're getting paid, $12 for a delivery, you pay them $5. DoorDash is just basically taking themselves off the hook for the $7 that they would have to pay these workers.
Yeah, naturally.
And this is a major problem.
Capitalism's bad, folks.
No, I mean,
we tried it. It's not working. It's not
really
working.
bad.
It's not a good system.
But we also need to recognize what this means. It's like, so these are all these kind of legal rules that these companies are getting around, are all things that were hard-fought, won victories of the labor movement across the country. But what happens when, working people aren't organized together, aren't basically in communication with each other, and are in such precarious work that they're sort of transitory, they become abused. But also the way that a lot of these corporations are trying to use, legal finagling to get out of any kind of legal protection for the workers is really bad, and it's becoming all too common. So private sector non-union employees, 56.2% of them are subject to mandatory employment arbitration procedures, right? This is from the Economic Policy Institute. So this is, again, you're foregoing your rights to a trial so that they can find an arbiter to figure out, your situation. 30.1% of those workers also include class action
figure
waivers.
out that situation.
We're going to figure it out for you.
Gotta take a look at it.
Situation being, here's a few scraps.
Situation being, sorry, not going to pay you.
And, this is a significant part of the economy. 24.7 million American workers no longer have the right. And, of course, there are ways to get out of this. But just, they'd have to go through a long legal process to go forward with a class action lawsuit. 24.7 million American workers, signed away their right to bring a class action claim if their employment rights have been violated. So this is really common in low-wage workplaces. It is much more common in industries that are composed of women workers, people of color, and again, low-wage workers. So this is our legal system being skewed to dominate, into the benefit of the wealthiest people and the most powerful organizations in the United States. And from legal weakness to precarity, corporations are using the poor situation of their workers that they create by paying them such low wages to maintain that domination over people. Just the other week, Uber and Lyft were revealed to be paying their drivers to show up at protests that were pushing for more regulations on the industry. And again, we're talking $100, $200, but when people need cash, they're going to accept it. Right. Fighting poverty must mean that we're fighting the power of bosses. And that means that we need to really be talking and creating movements that unite people. That's why movements, for example, like the Fight for 15 is so much bigger than just raising the minimum wage. That's creating class power and solidarity and those kind of unions and organizations that people need to be able to work in unison against a system that's trying to make them work as individual actors. And as long as they're working as individual actors, they're going to be completely abused by the system.
Excellent. All right, folks, here's what we're going to do. I just want to say it was a shortened pitch because the show's tight, but I want to get to 2,500 this month. By the end of this month, we're at 2,478. I just checked. Get us past 500 this month. 2,500 is our next clear goal, and we want to be well over 3,000 by the end of the year. On YouTube, we certainly want to get to 100,000 subscribers by the end of the year. And I'm wondering,
yeah, if you're not subscribed right now, do that right now.
Do that right now, and also kick us a contribution on Super Chat because it helps keep everything going, including the new folks that we have helping us with the YouTube channel and stuff like that. Next week, I will be wearing swag. We will all be wearing swag that has come in the mail, and that means that you can order dope TMBS gear extremely soon. And the only other thing I just want to say is, and I'm sorry, it's apropos of nothing, but tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning, here's me. Here's Matt. Here's Sam.
What Nadler just did was he just looked at Mueller, and so that was very interesting because Mueller said, I'm a prosecutor. And Nadler said, what about as not a prosecutor? No, I'm just kidding.
It's going to be important. It's going to be good. We just resent the early rising. But there's actually a way of plugging it. Get up early and watch the live stream with us. See if Matt and I pass out. Look, if they score a blow on him, that's great. I'm all about points on the board.
I'll just say that the jokes people sometimes make about water boats and such might be true tomorrow morning.
And I will just say that joke will be doubly true tomorrow. All right, folks, we're going to take a brief break, and then Joshua Kahn is going to join us. Very excited. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Very, very excited. Are we all set? Extremely excited to have joining us for the second time in studio my good friend, comrade. He's the executive director of the Wildfire Project. He has over 20 years of experience in direct action. He's going to share with us tactics that are relevant, as I said in the intro, whether you're in a movement of tens of thousands or 5 other people. Joshua Kahn, thank you for being back, brother.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
How's the mic on my man? Is
Check.
He good? Put it a little bit lower and make sure you talk into it.
All right, how's this?
Awesome. Oh, there we go.
Beautiful.
So last time you were on, we played a couple of in-depth games of how, and we were talking about how First Nation spirituality could affect how we play F, Marry, Kill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I forgot about that part.
Oh, I'm sorry. That was in the post game. No, I'm just kidding. I'm being annoying. We talked about movement strategy.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just reorient us a little bit? You have the Simpsons example. People really love the Simpsons example. Today we're going to talk about tactics, but can you reorient us towards, first of all, what is the difference?
Yeah. So, well, last time we talked about what I call social movement strategy.
Right.
And so that's how do you shift the balance of forces in a society. But the next layer down of strategy is campaign strategy. And so usually when most people hear the word campaign, they think like an electoral campaign. It can be that, but mostly what I'm talking about is you have an organized group of people that has a goal and sets a target with a demand and tries to win a demand by pressuring that target. And so then within that, your tactics are the stepping stones that get you there. And we actually have a diagram that can help with it.
Yeah, let's get the diagram up if we have that.
Yeah, because...
Is this up, guys? Awesome.
Great. People can confuse tactics and strategy often,
Yeah.
particularly leftists who have a cultural affinity for certain tactics. They're like, we love blockading because it's dope, but aren't driven by a longer path. And so just to situate what we're doing now is my hopes is that in this period we're in right now and in this coming period that's going to need a lot more mobilization. All right.
You can keep flowing.
Cool. Is it still? All right.
Yeah. Matt knows.
I believe Matt. We're going to need a lot more mobilization to win the gains that we're fighting for. And we have a lot more tools in our toolbox than rallies and marches.
Right.
And particularly as the terrain becomes more fluid and society gets more chaotic, fascism can thrive in those conditions.
Right.
And we need to learn from social movements of the way that they've been adaptable and creative in thriving in those conditions too. So the main kind of capsule of building a critical pathway of escalating tactics is a campaign. So you start on the left here is point A. So for those of you who are just listening on the podcast, there's just kind of a dot on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is your destination. That's your campaign goal. So that's like we're trying to stop a pipeline or we're trying to get, a local campaign. Like we're trying to get more, cheaper bus fare for youths. We're trying to, or we're trying to win a Green New Deal. It can be as big or small. And then you build a pathway with short, mid, and long-term goals. And the hash marks on the way, those are your tactics. So those are all of the actions. Those are all of the steps that you take building towards your goal. And the key thing about nonviolent direct action tactics and protest tactics in general is we're brought up in this country to think that change mostly happens through persuasion, like
Wrong.
of winning in the marketplace of ideas. Nonviolent direct action is about
sort
power.
of outside of politics. I'm seeing your because there's a chart here and there's the word politics isn't on it. That was fascinating.
It was so painful. It like hurt me in my body to watch that interview with Marianne and
See, in some ways we're so similar. And I think one of our core beautiful differences is that made my body happy. Until I got pissed, actually. I did at a certain point get broken by the just relentless stupidity. But anyways, back to it.
If I had seen it on video, it might have been better because I could have seen her reaction. But the key thing, like,
by the way, she increased too. By the end of that, she was becoming like, "Okay, Dave," to like, "Are you fucking kidding me?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, here's how that actually ties into this. Is that so? If you didn't hear that interview, Marianne Williamson was talking about
my second choice candidate,
social movements, street heat, popular mobilization, and how that wins gains. And Dave Rubin's response was like, "Oh, that's not even politics." And so my point here is the opposite, which is that politics is fundamentally about how you leverage power as people and gain more democratic control over the different aspects of your life, and then that trickles upward into the electoral arena. So if you want to go to the next slide, go back. Let's take a moment. Well, let's these hash marks. Let me just talk for another second about campaigns. Because when I say a campaign goal, there's lots of different kinds of goals that campaigns have. So there's your external sort of final goal, but all along the way, Your tactical goals, like the goal of a particular direct action, that can be internal. That can be, we want to be building our group and get our folks hype and connected. And part of the value of nonviolent direct action is when people take an emotional and spiritual risk of breaking the rules and taking care of each other despite the consequences by standing on the moral high ground, it binds your group together. So there can be internal goals for sure. There can be organizing goals of we're doing this tactic to be compelling to new people so they'll join our group. There can be pressure goals that you're actually leveraging power on your target. So that spread is like the difference between some tactics are about building the muscle, some tactics are about flexing the muscle to make the campaign look attractive, and some are about like actually punching.
Right.
And so we'll cover that range. And before we get into the different kinds of tactics, let's just take a moment and expand the toolbox. I wonder if the four of us here just brainstorm what are the names of some different tactics, like not specific ones, but kinds.
Milkshakes.
Milkshake.
Yeah, milkshaking people. Yeah.
Milkshaking. Marching.
What else?
Direct action.
What kinds?
Taking something that you want that's been taken from you.
So like land reclamation.
Yeah.
Or like Occupy Our Homes. Used to break into homes that were foreclosed and take them back, for example. Yeah, what else?
Being a nuisance on social media.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, I was going to say propaganda. That covers that.
Propaganda, right? Propaganda writ large.
Is there a term for like chaining yourself to something? Or?
Yeah. So there's all kinds of
civil
blockades.
disobedience.
Yeah, and we'll get into the distinction between direct action and civil disobedience in a minute, but blockades, blocking something from happening, you can do that with your bodies, you can do that with bicycles, but you can also, like Griscom's saying, like use what's called hard gear to actually lock down something. Like nobody gets in or out. We're using chains, we're using barrels. We can talk more about examples of that too. Anything else?
Sabotage.
The spear of South Africa. Yeah, thank you, David. Just tone it down there as yeah.
No, sabotage is especially
sabotage
in Europe.
Sabotage, especially where?
In Europe, there's a huge
World
tradition.
War II resistance. Yep. Well, but also, the spear of South Africa, sabotage. What about? I'm sorry. I'm totally blanking on something. I feel like there's something in between sabotage and land reclaiming, but I'm not thinking of it.
Squatting.
Yeah, but is that really sabotage? But okay,
No,
squatting. I don't think so at all.
What's in between those?
Yeah,
things?
it was something I thought was more confrontational. Okay, squatting, mocking people could be a tactic.
Yeah.
No, it actually
totally
ridicule could definitely be a tactic.
And this is totally different, but the same word. But like holding mock elections is a tactic. In general, guerrilla theater, street theater.
Street theater is a tactic.
You can do tree sits. You can do all kinds of banner hangs. I'm just trying to get the juice flowing. What else?
Good.
Well, so like one thing DSA
wearing
is
a
doing
Lula T-shirt to see Burner Boy at Prospect Park. That's pretty good.
It's like replacing brake lights. So is there a term for that? So it's like they're to protest against like police brutality, basically to raise awareness. They're replacing brake lights on cars for free.
It's sort of like service as a propaganda.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, community building services, sort of mutual aid to sustain community. I would say all education in the really broad set of terms, like in the Paulo Freire tradition, like telling people like your rights as a tenant and potentially where you could go on the offense against your landlord.
Yeah.
Maybe you could organize with everybody else. Maybe you could go on a rent strike.
Exactly. So it's a whole category. Of
rent
how
strikes
do we
would I would say its own
meet
category.
our own needs directly.
Boycotts are a category when they're done effectively. Obviously, strikes. I mean, I feel like strikes maybe are subsuming a lot of things that we've talked about.
Or related advertiser harassment campaigns.
Yes. Yes, I'm into that.
All the ad busting in the 90s. Yeah, so you get the idea, right? There's like a lot here. And one of the things that I just want to share for people who are interested, a lot of the frameworks that we're going to use are in 2 different organizing manuals that I helped write that are both free online.
These are really important resources.
And they both, one is called Beautiful Trouble, which there was 168 of us that contributed to it who are direct action practitioners. The other is specifically focused on climate, which is called Organizing Cools the Planet. You can go to both of those at the .org version of the titles. And on there, you can also get a list of 198 tactics that comes from Gene Sharp. So there's no excuse to just have boring marches, is I guess my point with this. And if you want to go to the next slide now, we can break some of those tactics into categories. So the first broad category is what most people are familiar with, which is protest. So that's like rallies, marches, letter writing, petitions, teach-ins, postcards, street theater, billboard liberation, banner hangs. All of those are kind of protest. And what a protest is basically like, it's shining the spotlight on an issue. It's like a big exclamation point. Non-cooperation, this is more typical civil disobedience, where you're withdrawing something from the system that makes it difficult to function. So you're withdrawing your participation, your money, your labor. And so that's consumer boycotts, labor strikes, general strikes, student walkouts, draft resistance, war tax resistance. Yeah,
I was just going to say burning your draft card, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or even fasting, right? And part of the point of non-cooperation is that it's collective. So if you don't shop somewhere, that's not a boycott. If you get thousands of other people to not shop somewhere, that's a boycott.
Right. You personally deciding to not support a company or whatever is fine if you want to make that decision. But that type of like personal consumer action, I'll just say it means nothing.
Yeah.
If you say we're going to try to get 20,000 people or whatever way you could, to any extent you could scale it, to say for the 2 days this Amazon strike happens, you're not going to do any transaction on Amazon. You actually hit a critical threshold.
Exactly.
That can do something.
Yeah.
But just saying I don't do Amazon doesn't mean anything.
Right.
Yes.
Which is part of why, and tactics are not about making you feel good or, we're all full of contradictions. And so when you're talking about this kind of arena, I've spent years campaigning against oil companies.
Right.
And I drive a vehicle that uses gas. I go on airplanes. I consume oil. I'm a part of the society. But when there's a campaign against Chevron, I don't get gas from Chevron because it helps the campaign because it's organized and has a target and actually contributes to pressure.
Right.
Me getting gas from Shell in the abstract isn't any different. Shell's just as bad. But the difference is there a campaign going on at that moment? And so the context for this stuff is important. So the next category is intervention. This is what a lot of people think of when they think of nonviolent direct action. So this is not withdrawing something from the system. This is like throwing the wrench in the gears. So this is like blockading roads or buildings, occupations, disrupting meetings, bird dogging, which is...
What is bird dogging?
Bird dogging, it's a weird term. It's where you like follow around a politician, and at every public forum they're at, you're asking the same question over and over, so they can't get away from it. Like the way that a dog follows a bird. I'm not a hunter. I don't know. I think
got it. Yeah.
I've been pheasant hunting. Dogs will sniff around in the brush until they find the actual bird and then kick it up into the air so you can get a shot at it.
So you get a shot at it?
Yeah.
That's nice.
So, it's about being relentless. Everything from like tree sits, you're getting in the way of stuff, basically.
Right.
Then the last one was what Griscom raised, which was these are the creative solutions. This is meeting your own needs directly. So building alternative community, this is everything from worker co-ops to, underground abortion clinics. This is, or to like the Panthers doing a breakfast program. So there's a pretty wide range of stuff that is available to us. And the way that I've worked for 15 years with an organization called the Ruckus Society, which supports groups doing nonviolent direct action. And the way Ruckus defines direct action is the strategic use of immediately effective acts to achieve a social or political end. So you can use these tactics in the economic terrain, in the social arena, and in the political arena as well. And if you have a good campaign, it threads all three, and we'll give examples of doing that. But why don't we get into... So I have a bunch of slides here with just different examples and some stories to tell to pull out some lessons.
Perfect.
Great.
Let's do it.
people who are watching may have seen this photo before. It's a pretty iconic photo. This is a lunch counter sit-in, Jackson, Mississippi, 1963, Woolworths. And the reason why I picked it first is it's a great example of a primary concept that I operate on, which we call action logic. So this was a moment when the campaign was to integrate lunch counters as part of a larger movement for racial justice and civil rights. And so the tactic was, this is traditional civil disobedience, where you're breaking the law. That is, the law itself is the injustice. So the law says black people and white people can't sit together at a lunch counter. You break that law, and out of principle. And the image here is black students and white students sitting in, and then this angry mob of people who would now, be the IDW crowd, throwing like.
No, the ID to be fair, and I hate the phrase "to be fair," but the IDW crowd would be like, we have to consider the consequences of not pouring milkshakes on these people.
Right.
Look, I'm an integrationist.
Yeah,
we need to consider the long-term
It would be
consequences.
to defend a few people in that picture who were doxxed by.
Right.
Yeah.
That would, exactly.
Yeah,
that would
exactly.
be it. Yes, it would be to find the narrow, irrelevant side point to have a moral panic about. Yes, exactly. Yes.
And so, all these angry white people are throwing food on them, and the reason that it has what we call action logic is you can look at this image and you immediately know what they want, you know who they are, you know who's against them, and you know why.
Right.
And it doesn't require any words. They're not holding protest signs. The image speaks for itself. It's logical. The act that they're doing itself tells the story, because even though direct action is fundamentally about material power and leveraging pressure, it also is fundamentally narrative-based. It's fundamentally about how do you tell a story of a pathway to liberation. And action, not every action needs to have high action logic, but when you're like blockading a highway, you need to do a lot more work to explain to people what you're doing, unless you're protesting the existence of that highway or something like that.
Right.
And so that's the first principle, action logic. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is an example of an action that I coordinated that had high action logic, which was, this was 10 years ago, 2009. So direct action can be incredibly material. It can also be about building a symbolic flashpoint, which was the goal of this action. So at the time, in the back of this picture, I couldn't find a better picture, but I thought this one was fun. There's smokestacks, and those smokestacks are from the coal-fired power plant that powered Congress. It literally powered the congressional building. And if you were to rotate the camera angle, you'd see the congressional building directly next to the smokestacks. And so there had been a lot of agitation around trying to get this power plant switched away from coal to clean energy. And it was actually Nancy Pelosi at the time who for years had been sort of waffling in the wind about it. And
I don't know about that. Fuck that.
Basically, the Democrats kept passing resolutions to do it and then not actually implementing them. And so
nice.
We coordinated.
Super core brand Democrat right there.
Totally. And so we shut it down. We brought a few thousand people and did an occupation. We blockaded the whole thing, nobody in or out, shut it down for a day. And so the action logic was clear. This is the coal-fired power plant that powers Congress literally and figuratively. The fossil fuel industry is powering Congress right now. And so the idea was to build a flashpoint action. This was like before Occupy Wall Street. This was before there were memes that really got underneath sort of moneyed influence. And there were a number of different campaigns going on around clean energy that were going to then leverage this message from that. And we actually, by the end of that day, Nancy Pelosi came out and announced that they were going to transition it off of coal. And then they did. And The reason why I share that is not because direct action usually has that much immediate satisfaction. And actually, it was kind of a sour satisfaction because they transitioned it to liquefied natural gas, which is fracking. So it's not actually that much better.
Yeah, they really have to make sure to be like, look, we'll do this. But at least some fucking water's getting lit on fire in Pennsylvania.
As long as we poison some people.
Yeah. It's like I heard
that was still when the Sierra Club was advocating for fracking. That was a different era
when
in
the mainstream environmental groups were they branded liquefied natural gas like the Obama of energy. They're like, it's not a clean transition, but it's also not fossil fuels either. It's a totally new thing.
And this was an intervention on those politics too. We had I'll talk in a minute about the difference between your target and your audience.
Right.
But your targets who you're trying to pressure, your audience is all the people who are impacted by the action, and we're trying to impact the terrain of the environmental movement. And it was basically planting the seeds for what became the Keystone XL pipeline campaign of pushing these groups to be much more embracing of nonviolent direct action. And but the other thing I'll say about Pelosi jumping in front, a lot of times self-righteous activists get frustrated when politicians jump in front of the parade after it's organized to take credit for stuff and cry about co-optation. And co-optation is a real thing. There's things to watch out for, but it's a metric of success.
Right.
And the reason that we do nonviolent direct action tactics, if we're trying to pressure a politician, my friend Daniel Hunter talks about it like politicians are like a balloon, and they kind of waffle in the wind. And the terrain of advocacy, as opposed to direct action or lobbying, is like blowing on the balloon, trying to get it to move. What direct action? But those balloons, it's tied to a rock. It can only go so far, right? And that rock is the material interest of those politicians. It's either their constituency or their funding base. And the goal of campaigns is to move the rock. And so we're not getting concerned with lobbying a politician to take this or that stance. We're moving their constituency, so they have to take that stance if they're in power. And that's the way that, for example, Sunrise is building movements for the Green New Deal and trying to force politicians to take a stand by demonstrating public pressure. Right. That's how direct action is like moving the rock, as distinct from advocacy. So you want to go to the next one?
Yeah, let's go to the next one.
Great. Actually, yeah, before you can leave this one up, but before I get to this, I will just say something about the Keystone campaign, because those actions did not have action logic. That was, we started by doing this, what was it? We were basically, people were locking themselves to the White House gates.
Yep.
And we did
a
series of 12 days of mass, we called it civil disobedience, but it wasn't technical civil disobedience because people were getting arrested, but the law that was being broken was just like some ridiculous law about tourism, like you can't block the gates so that tourists can take photos.
Right.
If we were protesting that law...
You ever see that picture, by the way, of Pablo Escobar and his kid in front of the White House taking that photo?
No.
It's It's an amazing photo.
Nice.
Pretty funny. So you were interrupting.
So we would have interrupted
potentially Pablo Escobar taking a picture with his kid in front of the White House, so you could stop economic development.
Right.
See, I could be on Fox.
That's the reason we did it.
I could be on
That's
Fox.
the reason we did it.
Maybe they wanted to experience America, but because you hate freedom so much, Pablo Escobar and his kid can't have a family moment, and he's an entrepreneur. All
wow.
Right, I'll stop being stupid. Go ahead.
Wow, you'd be so good at that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the point
so
is
in a way, you were in front of the White House. It wasn't really politics. You were just saying we want to eat organic smoothies. In a certain sense.
Smoothies. In a certain sense.
In a certain sense.
In a certain sense.
All right.
So we had to just work a lot harder to make our message clear.
Right.
So we had to have really clear signs and messaging. We had to have our spokespersons on lock. We had to, and in that case, the arrests, they were basically just bait to get media attention in a way. Mm-hmm. And there's a double-edged sword to that. Like in a lot of conditions, like in most freedom struggles, getting captured is seen as a bad thing.
Yeah, right. It's not highly emphasized.
Yeah,
right.
But sometimes you can provoke arrests in order to control the media narrative, if that's part of your strategy. And sometimes campaigns get a little bit too distracted by the media stuff and away, like towards spectacle and away from the material. But if you're doing it with intention, that is how what started as a flashpoint action at the White House became a multi-year-long campaign to stop an oil pipeline that was grassroots driven from frontline indigenous communities all over the country that were doing real material block. So instead of having kind of a fake blockade in front of the White House, it was literally blockading oil tankers so they couldn't get through, and pushing the pipeline timeline further so that the legal case had more time to run through. So these things thread together in terms of material impacts. But so to jump to the one here, since we're on the topic of narrative. So this is from the WTO, Battle in Seattle, 1999. And this is the Ruckus Society dropping a banner. And in the media terrain, the reason why I wanted to include this is just to give a shout out to activists who are sick of outrage culture and just saying, we're against everything and we're against this and no.
Right.
The reason why that's ineffective is that the audience then needs to decide who you are and whether, like, if you're against it, are they with you or are they with the much more reasonable person that's seeming person that's arguing against you?
Right.
And at the time, in 1999, when the global justice movement was just getting visible in the United States, it had been going in the global South for quite some time. Most people in the country didn't know who the World Trade Organization was. And so when the Ruckus Society did this dramatic tactic of climbing a crane in front of the Seattle Space Needle.
I literally remember this as a teenager.
Me too. This was like
powerful.
Politicizing moment.
Powerful.
For me.
Yep.
And this was a collaboration with Ruckus and then Rainforest Action Network, which I also worked at for several years. And so these climbers scaled the crane, dropped the banner, and instead of instead of saying WTO with like a no sign around it or like an anti-symbol, they framed it as a clash of values, right? So democracy's going this way, the WTO's going that way. The audience can bring their pre-existing values to their assessment of what you're doing, and it tells a whole story in it.
And this was, by the way, in the context of these protests, and yes, there were some things that the media focused on. There was some, windows broken at Starbucks, which, look, I no moral claim that wasn't an effective tactic at this time, and nor was it then, in my opinion, purely because that was like the prime vehicle of distraction of issues. Thomas Friedman wrote some fucking idiotic columns about how the people protesting didn't understand how trade worked. But the big takeaway was actually, and I remember this because I was transfixed. It was the first moment, if you were a 90s kid, where you actually felt like, wait a second, there are people on the street for a different world that is built. It's, less concrete and specific, I think, than the much better, more developed socialist politics that are animating us now. But it was like, no, there has to be values about labor, about democracy, about the environment, and so on. Bill Clinton came out, and, look, it's Bill Clinton, and it wasn't honest. But he was like, they're right to be protesting. He understood viscerally precisely this message, which is that, look, if you drown out all of the bullshit and all the Friedman wonkery and all of this nonsense, people understand that this is global capitalist bureaucracy against democracy.
And that was moving the rock.
Yes.
That swayed his balloon.
Yes.
And it would have really gone a long way if 9/11 hadn't happened and dropped bombs on the rock.
Yes.
No pun intended.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
I guess the last thing I'll say about this, so this is an action just 10 people were a part of this. This required serious resources to do, of course, but they dropped this banner the day before the meetings happened, when there was going to be thousands of people protesting the meetings, interrupting them. And the newspapers on that day, this was on the front page. And so this framed everything that people were going to interpret afterwards. And so the goal of this action was to control the narrative of what was about to happen so that people could leverage smarter tactics in opposition to the Friedman narrative and stuff like that you were talking about. That's where the battle of ideas does come in.
Yep.
And so there's a lot of different considerations when you design a tactic, and this, for if you're watching, forgive the amount of words on this next slide. But this is just an example of one of the tools.
Ooh, there's a lot of words. Whoa.
So many ideas.
So many ideas. I have to, wait, we need that drop. I'll just say it. I'll step on it. I think we need recovery mode drop for this slide, buddy.
Yeah, it's gonna,
I literally...
It's going to knock you into recovery mode for sure.
I have to say that my brain is still in recovery mode from taking in so many high-level important ideas.
Recovery mode's actually a step on the action planning under celebration.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah, is that debrief?
All right, break this down, man.
So this was developed by Beyond the Choir initially, adapted in Organizing Cools the Planet. But these are just some of the consideration. Designing a tactic is a lot of work and requires rigor. Mm-hmm. And so it starts by developing your goals and strategy, which is basically the map that we started out with earlier. And I'm not going to read all of the smaller text under here, but if you are organizing with a group and you're listening to the podcast and you want to access this, what these dots are different questions to ask your group that will help you refine your strategy, help you consider these different points. So the next is the history and the location. Where are you doing this action? What is the history of the impact that the local community may face if a bunch of police are brought into the area? Right. What is the context of the history of work on the campaign? Knowing your context is the first step after strategy. Then it's about setting your target. And so again, a target is who is the person or institution who has the power to give you your demand, period, full stop. And there's ways that, and I'll talk later about secondary and tertiary targets, which are who pressures those people. So I'll read a couple of the bullet points, which is, what message will a tactic send to the people who have the power to meet our demands? Will it pressure them to capitulate or enable them to dismiss us or retaliate, right? So when you are escalating your tactics, you are flexing your muscle. And if you do a tactic too soon that actually communicates, we don't have much power, and a bunch of angry activists screaming on the sidewalk actually tells the story, we're marginal and don't have much power.
Right.
Right. And so then you might want a more creative way of using that group of people. How will you know if you've impacted your target? What are your metrics of success? And are you prepared for the target's reaction, which is part of, I'll get to the window smashing thing later and why that's such a dumb tactic, but anticipating the reaction of your opposition is really important. So next, your target's distinct from your audience, which is that who do you want to reach with the tactic? What do you want to inspire within them? Is the tactic, who is the media reaching? Are you just doing social media because you're trying to build the enthusiasm of your base? Are you trying to grow your base? Are you trying to win over new allies? Before, when we talked about the spectrum of allies on the last show, we talked about tactics being neutral in the sense that any tactic is going to alienate some people and attract other people. So are you doing that on purpose? Are you attracting the people that you want and need? And don't worry about the people that you might alienate if they're not going to be connected to your campaign anyway. The next is relationships. And so this is key. This is about coalitions, alliance building, in terms of unlikely alliances, but it's also about accountability to the people who are most impacted by the issue. And so how grounded are you in the issue that you're taking on? And people who live day to day with the material consequences of the issue you're fighting are always the best spokespeople, always have the most insights about the nature of the problem.
Bernie Sanders campaign. You have people who work at Walmart saying Bernie Sanders is the best advocate for us.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah,
right.
And have the biggest insights for
right.
solutions.
They understand it best. They live it.
Yeah.
Right.
So then next is timing, right? So how can we leverage unfolding events right now as opportunities, and does the political moment hold potential for us or vulnerability for the target? Next is the tone. Your action could be anything. It could be angry. It could be jubilant. It could be solemn. It just depends on the message you're trying to communicate and the action logic of that. Next, we talked about message already. Next is organization. How well does it build the work that you're doing? Resources, really mapping out what's it going to cost in terms of hours, time, money, materials, relationships. What are the resources that you have? Then celebration is a super important step, which leftists like hate to celebrate when victories are not perfect. And it's so important to be building a campaign that you celebrate your victories.
Claim wins.
And that's when you can go into recovery mode from all the high-level ideas. And then debrief is when you evaluate and make meaning of what's going on, and we'll talk about that at the end in terms of praxis. So that's just like a little taste of some of the tools that are here that I'd really encourage people to use.
So I just want to, so we're going to need to go to the post game in a minute. So we'll get some more of these lessons, and we'll also talk a little about what's happening in Hawaii in the post game. But I just want to throw one out there because it's something I haven't particularly cared to talk about one way or another, to be honest, because I just genuinely think mostly this is a overhyped bullshit story. But I want to give you, I want to run by you an example too of also like redundancy of tactics and why things may or may not work in certain contexts.
Right.
So, and you know, I'll just say my reactions. I'm not advocating that anybody do anything. I think when that guy punched Richard Spencer when Trump was getting inaugurated, that what ended up being an incredibly positive cultural moment because there was a symbolism, there was an action logic that was like, nah, actually, like the new thing isn't going to just be, you know, people, you know, with this kind of politics strutting around the streets, and people are going to, you know, get in people's faces, right? Now, and I'm making no moral claim about this, although, you know, I have criticisms of a lot of these tactics that are being enlisted. That kid, Andy No, who is a complete asshole, I have absolutely zero respect for, I don't care about.
He's a reactionary propagandist.
He's a reactionary propagandist and many other things that I frankly probably should not say. That milkshake interaction was a net positive for him. Period. It's good for his career, raised a huge amount of money. His podcast with Joe Rogan was the most downloaded podcast on iTunes, period. Like, not just in a vertical. So people have to start to ask themselves, like, in which context does which tactic make sense? And when does something become not only potentially super self-indulgent and limited, but actually literally precisely the kind of feedback loop that someone like Andy No wants? And again, I can already hear certain people being like, you know, you don't get it, and you're doing, you know, you're being you're doing moralism. And I'm telling you, stripping everything aside, who won from that incident?
Yep, I agree.
Who is the winner? Andy No and the brand of that bullshit reactionary concern troll nonsense is the big winner. And there's that asshole from Quillette. And I understand that he's been involved in other things. I know that objection too. And those things were actually being reported on and documented so that Andy No's first cycle of broader public notoriety was, I don't think this guy's really a journalist. His second cycle was the most downloaded podcast on iTunes. It's not, I'm sorry, it's not a good tactic. And that might trigger some people, but it's not a smart play. And I always want to get specifically into, in a non-moralistic way, how do we actually assess our tactics and not become addicted to them?
Yeah, exactly. The thing I'll say about that is, like, this is the best thing we can learn from the global justice era, because during that period and for a while afterwards, there were all of these mass mobilizations at the IMF, at the WTO, and there were all of these like really unhelpful debates about violence and nonviolence.
Right.
What constitutes violence? Is is property destruction violence? Blah blah blah.
Right.
And the left loved to get stuck in those moralistic arguments, and I would facilitate coalition meetings at some of these summits and convergences where people were literally invoking, like, well, the Zapatistas defined violence as this, so therefore I want to smash a window.
Right.
And it was all ideological. It was all abstract. And at first, as a nonviolence trainer, earlier in my time, it was like I engaged it on that level, right, and tried to complicate it and tease it, and then I realized the antidote to it is just doing strategy training, because both in the example that you just gave and in window smashing at the WTO kind of example, you can anticipate the reaction. And when you go around that tactic star, when you anticipate both your target's response, the police response, even if you disagree with
the media response,
like there was a G8 protest where there were all of there's groups that wanted to light garbage cans on fire and stuff like that. And if they had just had a conversation that said, we know that if this happens, the police will do mass arrests, they will target specific activists, and it'll be very expensive.
We already know that there are agent provocateurs from the police and other agencies in these protests to begin with, and what a perfect conduit if you're already committed to taking a dumb action.
And so they did it, and the consequence millions of dollars of legal costs that were then put on the movement of all of these fundraisers to raise money for these imprisoned activists. And of course it was unjust that they got ridiculous sentences. I mean, the way the state threw their weight around was but that wasn't the point. The point was if you instead proposed even saying, okay, let's say that lighting a trash can on fire is a smart tactic. Is it worth all of us collectively raising money, raising $6 million over the next 6 months? Is it that good? Nobody could have said yes. And so if you stick in the terrain of strategy and material outcomes and agreed upon goals with metrics you can actually evaluate, all of that nonsense falls to the side.
Is milkshaking, some asshole worth somebody who did not know who he was yesterday and would never know who he was, finding out about him for the first time in the context of him being
I need to make a distinction between milkshaking and punching, because Andy Ngo was milkshaked numerous times.
Oh, you're talking about the physical assault.
Right, exactly.
You're right.
Ngo was milkshaked numerous times before the punching happened, and he would go up to police and say, "Hey, I was just assaulted." And they're like, "With the milkshake?" And he's like, "Yeah, with the milkshake." And get the fuck out of here.
Yeah, get the fuck out of here. Stop wasting our time. But even the milkshake thing is another thing too of again, it's hilarious. I've seen great ones. And when does that become not the thing to do anymore?
Yeah. And
not as a moral thing, but just literally understanding you can't be addicted to a tactic. And I think, my position is on an abstract level, I'll just put it this way, I just don't want to be super specific, but there's any number of movements in different contexts who have enlisted actual non-theoretical violence that at the very least I'll say I don't judge, right? I clearly judge any tactic that specifically targets innocent civilians of any kind. I 100% oppose, and I think we all have to oppose, or that just fundamentally contradicts what we're trying to do. But there's many other contexts that you could take from many other examples, whether it's struggling against apartheid or the Cuban or Vietnamese revolutions or the underground resistance to the Nazis or whatever, that employed a lot of different types of tactics that I have zero, cannot emphasize enough, zero moral judgment of. In the context we're in, both the media environment we're talking about, and on the flip side, and this is something I just wanted you to touch on briefly before we go to the post game, a huge increase at the state level of laws being put on the books to criminalize, in fact, literal nonviolent actions. So the dial is actually these social media controversies and little games are getting played out. Some of them are important, some of them, I'm sorry, are not. And then the broader structure is actually a system of policies being put in place that, as an example, could actually make it legal for somebody to run over a protester doing a highway protest, make the people at Standing Rock accountable for the legal bills and security that the private firms sent to terrorize them. And then the last thing I just really briefly want to add, because I think it's important. I think, Marx identified the working class function not as a moral the goals of getting rid of injustice and oppression were moral, but it was also it was super strategic. It was laborers are that's the counterweight to all the power in the world is numbers. And so when you start thinking in a large cohesive group that can actually synchronize to do large cohesive things, that is when you still have to start thinking of building a left that is literally broadly appealing. Because you need to be able to do mass scale things like strikes.
And if you want, I think the key takeaway that I'm hearing in what you're saying too is that militancy and anger works if you have the moral high ground, which is why, for example, the Panthers are so compelling.
Absolutely.
And having the moral high ground isn't just about dressing in a suit, and it's not like respectability politics necessarily, but there are some tactics like throwing a milkshake kind of randomly that fundamentally doesn't carry with it the moral weight of indigenous people occupying their sacred site, so it's not destroyed.
I'm sorry, just one other really quick example. Several years ago, Rupert Murdoch was engulfed in a massive scandal in the United Kingdom. The first time, and maybe the only time in this man's political career, that there was actual, somewhat political pressure on him. He's called to Parliament. He's getting grilled, including by politicians that had probably previously been in his pocket.
Louis Mensch
is asking him hard questions. He looks uncomfortable. He looks clammy. Then some asshole throws a pie in his face.
Johnny Marbles.
His wife at the time, Wendy Dang, punches the guy. All the headlines are idiot throws pie in old man's face. Right. Wife defends him. Stories totally obscured.
Yep. I'm curious I have some stories I want to tell in the post game.
Yes.
I'm curious if we have time for one more quick one.
One more quick one, then we'll go to the post game.
Okay, cool. So then we'll do the last slide for now, and I'm going to save the best ones for the post game, which is why you should become a patron. It's why I'm a patron, because the best shit's on the post game.
Dipset.
So,
all right, go.
If you can go to the next slide. This is from 2010. This is when in Arizona they passed the SB 1070 Show Me Your Papers law, and
precursor to the Trump era, right here.
Exactly. And the resistance that at the time was led by local groups Tonatiuh and Puente, Arizona, as well as the local Unitarian Universalists, really organized a wide variety of mass mobilizations that had all kinds of creativity. There was not just a mass march, there was like a giant banner hang similar to the WTO thing. But these two images I just pulled up because they both have a material component as well as a symbolic component. So on the top, this was a blockade that we supported over here. These are undocumented people, and there's also a priest who are using what are called lock boxes. So Griscom was getting excited about chains earlier. This is like a version of gear that gives you staying power.
Can we talk about chains, sir?
And all the gear is about is like, how do we hold the space for as long as possible? And the space that they're holding this is where the buses go into and out of when they try to do raids. So the day that the law got passed, there were all of these raids planned. We shut down their jails. We shut down their facility that to not allow the buses to even leave. And in that action, when we were arrested, Arpaio was so... later I'll tell you Arpaio's stories of how much of a creep he is, but he did our work for us in the media. He went out and said he didn't even say activists. He said these community members stopped us from doing these raids. There were thousands of people that we were going to deport that we couldn't deport because of what they did. And we were like, thank you. That's like exactly the story that we were going for.
Right.
But just wanted to give one example of a material consequence, and that was prefigured and then followed by all over the country at ICE headquarters and various kinds of jail facilities. People are doing blockades right now. This is a long tradition in San Francisco where people are blockading and preventing buses from leaving to go do raids and bring people in for deportation. The image underneath was a component of the campaign where local businesses would put up these stickers that said Arizona Human Rights Zone in their window. And what that signified was if the police come and try to basically the police would raid places. And they said, if the police come, we're going to not let them in, invoke our rights as private property holders. And if there's any undocumented people in our kitchen, any undocumented people in the back, we won't give them up to the cops. So it was basically a commitment to civil disobedience. And hundreds of businesses all over downtown put them up. And then we did a giant kind of human banner and occupied an intersection to sort of stamp the banner on downtown Phoenix for the day.
Right.
And so those are two examples of what was a multifaceted action that was part of a much larger escalatory campaign that planted seeds for where we're at now.
Amazing. Sorry. Jessica Peterson,
You
I'm
sounded-
sorry.
yeah, totally.
Amazing. But it actually is amazing. Guys, you need to follow all of Joshua's work. We have we've done patron shows together, which also get into a lot of this stuff, specifically on climate and global ecology activism. And we're going to obviously be doing a lot more together. But check out Wildfire Project. That's the primary way to find you. Get these books and join us in the post game. We have a ton to get to. We're going to be, of course, doing a debunk with Ben Burgess. We're going to continue some of these lessons, get to Hawaii, talk about Boris Johnson a little bit. Got a bunch to get to.
Can I do a quick wildfire pitch?
Please.
So if you go to wildfireproject.org, we're actually in a donor drive right now. And just like you can become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show, you can become a sustainer of the Wildfire Project. And what we do is we accompany frontline movement organizations over long periods of time to support training and development and transformation. And we're trying to reach a $20,000 goal this month to support a couple different organizations that we can maybe even talk more about in the post game. They're doing really incredible work on the cutting edge of a bunch of different movement sectors, from economic justice to immigrant rights to climate justice. To Black liberation and ecological justice. So please come and support us. Anything that you can toss our way, we'd be grateful for.
Awesome. Do it. Patreon.com/TMBS as well, of course. I want to thank everybody. I appreciate all of you so much. We'll see you in the post game.